Life can change in a heartbeat. For Sarah Mitchell, that moment came on a bitter December night at the Riverside Diner, when a $5 bill and an act of kindness collided with destiny. She couldn't have known that by morning military tanks would surround her workplace, or that her simple gesture would trigger a chain of events that would expose a decorated war hero and transform an entire community. But sometimes, the smallest acts of compassion can spark the biggest changes. This is a story about how one waitress's decision to listen to her heart would not only cost her everything she had, but lead her to everything she never knew she needed. The neon open sign flickered weakly against the frost-covered windows, casting an eerie red glow across the empty tables. Sarah's fingers drummed nervously on the worn countertop as she watched the clock inch toward midnight. Her tip jar held exactly $23.47, not nearly enough to cover next week's rent. 6 years at the Riverside Diner had taught her every crack in the linoleum floor, every scratch on the chrome counter, every regular customer's coffee preference. But lately, those familiar details felt more like chains than comfort. At 28, she was still living paycheck to paycheck, her dreams of college long since buried under mounting bills and minimum wage reality. The photo tucked behind the register caught her eye, her father in his marine dress blues, taken before his final deployment. He'd come back different, struggling to adjust to civilian life. The VA benefits barely covered his medical bills, and the proud man who once commanded troops now couldn't hold down a job at the local hardware store. He'd passed away 3 years ago, leaving Sarah with nothing but memories and a folded flag. The evening rush had dwindled to nothing, typical for a Tuesday night in their small town. Sarah wiped down the counter for the third time in 10 minutes, her mind wandering to the stack of past due notices in her apartment. The rent was due in 5 days, and she was still short by $200. The holiday season had been particularly slow this year, and tips were getting scarcer as the winter deepened. The bell above the door chimed, its cheerful tone jarring in the empty diner. A gust of December wind swept in, carrying with it a tall figure who seemed to bear the weight of the world on his shoulders. Sarah's first instinct was to reach for the "closing soon" sign. It was already 11:45 p.m., but something in the man's bearing made her pause. He moved with a measured grace that seemed at odds with his weathered appearance. His jacket, though clean, was worn at the elbows, and his boots had seen better days. But it was his eyes that caught Sarah's attention, deep-set and alert, scanning the room with an unconscious precision that reminded her of her father. "Evening, miss," his voice was quiet but carried a natural authority. He pulled out a crumpled $5 bill from his pocket, smoothing it carefully on the counter. "What can this get me?" Sarah glanced at the menu board. The cheapest item was the breakfast special at $8.99. She looked back at the man, noting how he held himself ramrod straight despite his obvious exhaustion. His hands, she noticed, bore the subtle tremor she'd often seen in her father's, the kind that spoke of battles fought far from home. Actually, she heard herself say, "We've got a veterans special tonight." The words came naturally, even though no such special existed. Full dinner for $5. His eyes met hers, sharp and assessing. For a moment, she thought he might challenge the obvious lie. Instead, the corner of his mouth twitched slightly. "Marines?" he asked softly. "My father," she replied, touching the photo behind the register. 3rd Battalion, 2nd Marines. He nodded once, a world of understanding passing between them. "David," he offered simply. "Sarah," she responded, already moving toward the kitchen. "Give me 5 minutes." The kitchen door slammed open with such force that the bell above the entrance chimed in protest. Tom Bradley, owner of the Riverside Diner, stood in the doorway, his face flushed red beneath his receding hairline. His eyes darted from the plate Sarah was preparing to the crumpled $5 bill on the counter. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" His voice carried the sharp edge of barely contained anger. Sarah's hands stilled over the plate, but she kept her voice steady. "Making a late dinner for a customer, Tom. Don't play dumb with me." He strode forward, snatching the order ticket. "Veterans Special? Since when do we have a Veterans Special?" His voice rose with each word, echoing off the empty walls. Sarah straightened her spine, feeling a familiar anger rise in her chest. The same anger she'd felt watching her father struggle with VA paperwork and dismissive bureaucrats. "I'm covering the difference myself." Tom's laugh was harsh and cutting. "Oh, so now my diner's a charity?" He turned to David, who sat perfectly still, his posture rigid but his face carefully blank. "Listen, buddy, we're running a business here, not a soup kitchen. If you can't afford..." "He can afford dignity and respect," Sarah cut in, her voice sharp. "Something you clearly can't recognize." The diner fell into a deadly silence. Even the ancient ceiling fan seemed to hold its breath. Tom's face darkened to a dangerous shade of purple. "You're fired." The words hung in the air like smoke. Sarah blinked, certain she'd misheard. "What?" "You heard me. Clean out your locker and get out. Both of you." Tom grabbed the plate she'd been preparing and dumped it into the trash with a theatrical flourish. "I don't need bleeding hearts driving my business into the ground." David stood slowly, his movements deliberate and controlled. "The lady was just trying to help." "Well, her help just cost her her job." Tom's smirk was triumphant. "Maybe next time she'll learn to mind her own business." Sarah's hands trembled as she untied her apron. 6 years of service, countless double shifts, every holiday worked, all ended because she'd tried to do the right thing. She thought of her empty bank account, the unpaid bills, the looming rent deadline. But when she looked at David, saw the quiet dignity in his bearing despite the humiliation, she knew she'd make the same choice again. "You know what, Tom?" She placed her apron on the counter with exaggerated care. "My father always said you can tell the measure of a person by how they treat those who can't fight back. I guess we both know your measure now." The next morning dawned bitter cold, with frost etching delicate patterns on store windows along Main Street. Sarah clutched a stack of job applications, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. She'd spent a sleepless night calculating how long her savings would last, 2 weeks, maybe 3 if she skipped meals. Then she heard it. A deep, mechanical rumbling that seemed to vibrate through the sidewalk beneath her feet. Around the corner came something straight out of a military parade, 3 armored Humvees, followed by a convoy of olive-drab vehicles that stretched the length of the block. The entire town seemed to freeze as the convoy rolled to a stop directly in front of the Riverside Diner. From the lead vehicle stepped a tall figure in dress blues, his chest decorated with rows of medals that caught the morning sun. Behind him, a dozen Marines formed a precise line, their presence commanding immediate attention. But it was the second figure that made Sarah's heart stop, David. Gone were the worn clothes and exhausted slouch. He stood ramrod straight in a crisp uniform adorned with medals, including one that Sarah recognized from her father's military books, the Navy Cross, one of the highest honors a Marine could receive. Through the diner's window, she could see Tom Bradley's face drain of color. The morning customers pressed against the glass, phones raised to capture whatever was about to unfold. Colonel James Morrison, United States Marine Corps, the first man announced, his voice carrying across the now silent street. And this, he gestured to David, is Master Sergeant David Chen, one of the most decorated Marines of his generation. A man who saved 16 of his fellow Marines during an ambush in Fallujah, who earned the Navy Cross for valor under fire, and who was treated like garbage in your establishment last night. Sarah watched as Tom Bradley stumbled out of the diner, his previous arrogance replaced by a sickly pallor. I didn't know. Exactly, David's voice cut through the air like steel. You didn't know. You didn't care to. No. You just saw what you wanted to see. Colonel Morrison's eyes swept the gathering crowd before landing on Sarah. Miss Mitchell? She stepped forward, heart hammering against her ribs. The colonel's stern expression softened slightly. Master Sergeant Chen told us what happened last night. But more importantly, he told us about your father, Staff Sergeant John Mitchell, 3rd Battalion, 2nd Marines. Sarah's throat tightened at her father's name. The colonel continued, your father served with distinction. He was the kind of Marine who never left anyone behind. It seems that spirit lives on in you. He reached into his uniform pocket and withdrew an official-looking envelope. The Marine Corps is launching a new initiative, the Veterans Transition Program. We're opening centers across the country to help veterans readjust to civilian life, find employment, and access the support they need. Our research shows that the most successful programs are run by people who understand both military and civilian life. Tom Bradley chose that moment to interrupt, his business instincts overriding his fear. Now wait just a minute. If you're looking for a location, the Riverside Diner would be happy to. Mr. Bradley, David's voice was quiet but carried an authority that made Tom flinch. In the Marines, we have a saying, character is what you do when no one is watching. Last night, you showed your character. Miss Mitchell showed hers. The colonel handed Sarah the envelope. We'd like to offer you the position of Community Outreach Director for our new center here in town. Full benefits, competitive salary, and most importantly, the chance to help veterans like your father get the support they deserve. Sarah stared at the envelope, her vision blurring with tears. But I'm just a waitress. I don't have any qualifications. You have the most important qualification, David said softly. You see people for who they are, not what they appear to be. That's something that can't be taught. The crowd had grown larger, and Sarah could hear whispers rippling through it. She saw Mrs. Henderson from the bakery nodding approvingly, and Mr. Parker, the hardware store owner who'd fired her father, looking distinctly uncomfortable. 3 weeks later, Sarah stood in the newly renovated Veterans Transition Center, formerly an abandoned warehouse on Main Street. The transformation was remarkable. Warm lighting replaced harsh fluorescence, comfortable seating areas invited conversation, and the walls displayed photographs of local veterans alongside resources for employment, housing, and support services. Her first success story walked through the door that morning. James Cooper, a young veteran who'd been sleeping in his car for 3 months. Miss Mitchell? His voice was hesitant, clutching the flyer David had distributed at the local shelter. I heard you might be able to help. Sarah recognized the same look she'd seen in David's eyes that night at the diner, pride wrestling with desperation. Come on in, James. Coffee's fresh, and we've got some people you should meet. By noon, James had an interview scheduled at the local mechanic shop, an appointment with a housing counselor, and, most importantly, the beginning of hope in his eyes. David stopped by regularly, sometimes bringing other veterans who needed help, other times just to check on their progress. The center became more than just an office. It evolved into a community hub where veterans could find understanding, support, and purpose. One day, as Sarah was reviewing applications for their job placement program, she overheard two veterans talking in the common area. "You know, I walked past this place 3 times before I got the courage to come in," one said. "Yeah," replied the other. "What made you finally do it?" "Saw Miss Mitchell helping old Bill with his paperwork. Reminded me of my sister, you know, someone who actually gives a damn." Sarah smiled, remembering her father's words, "Sometimes the biggest battles aren't fought with weapons, but with kindness." 6 months after the center opened, Sarah received news that would validate everything they'd been working for. The Department of Veterans Affairs had selected their center as a national model, citing their unprecedented success rate in veteran rehabilitation and community integration. The celebration dinner was held, ironically, in the newly reopened Veterans Corner Cafe, formerly known as the Riverside Diner. Tom Bradley had sold the place to a veteran couple who'd gone through their program, transforming it into a warm, welcoming space where veterans could always find a hot meal and understanding company. As Sarah stood to give her speech, she saw faces in the crowd that told the real story of their success. James Cooper, now the head mechanic at Parker's Auto Shop; Maria Ramirez, a former combat medic who'd started a successful physical therapy practice; and dozens more veterans who'd found their way back to civilian life through the center's programs. 6 months ago, Sarah began, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I thought losing my job was the worst thing that could happen to me. But sometimes, what feels like an ending is really a beginning in disguise." She caught David's eye in the crowd. He nodded slightly, the same quiet dignity in his bearing that she'd noticed that first night, but now accompanied by something else. Pride, not just in himself, but in what they'd built together. "My father used to say that the measure of a community isn't in its buildings or businesses, but in how it treats those who've sacrificed everything to protect it. Today, I'm proud to say our community measures up." Later that evening, as the celebration wound down, Sarah found herself standing outside the cafe, looking up at the stars. David joined her, both of them comfortable in the silence that comes with shared purpose. "You know what I think about sometimes," she said finally. "That $5 bill. How something so small could change everything." David smiled, reaching into his wallet. He pulled out a worn, carefully folded $5 bill, the same one from that night. "I kept it," he said quietly, "to remind me that hope often comes from unexpected places." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. "Or unexpected people." "No," David shook his head. "The right people, at the right time, making the right choices. That's not unexpected, that's destiny." If this story touched your heart, remember that heroes walk among us every day. Sometimes they wear uniforms, and sometimes they wear waitress aprons. But they all share one thing, the courage to choose kindness when it matters most. Hit that like button if you believe in the power of small acts of kindness. Subscribe for more stories that prove humanity still has hope. Share this video to spread the message that one person can make a difference. Leave a comment below. What small act of kindness changed your life?